this in mind, please give a warm hand, Jessica.
Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Cool, great. Yeah, hi again. I'm Jessica, and thank you again for the great introduction. I'm really happy to be here, and today I actually would like to talk to you about webcomics. And specifically, I want to share with you some learnings that I made when I tried to create my own webcomic, because I'm very enthusiastic about it. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you might have like a better understanding how you could do something similar yourself. And if you're like an artist at heart yourself, you might also find inclined to actually try it out. And yeah, this is mostly what my talk is about. I think like probably a pretty good setup for like the second to last talk of like such a great conference. And before we get started, of course, a few words about myself. You already heard a bit about it, but I want to share a bit about where I'm coming from. I'm from Berlin. Here you can see the beautiful skyline at night of the city. And in fact, I'm very in love with the city. But I also realized in the 5 years that I've been living there, I'm actually the one single person in the whole city that didn't move here for the techno scene, but for the vegetarian food instead, which is pretty great actually. So if you yourself are into veggies, you should definitely check it out. And like probably even if you're not vegetarian, you should definitely check it out. I'm also UI developer working at Netscape, simplabs. And we are a consultancy specialized in Ember.js consulting, but also Ruby on Rails and Phoenix and Elixir. And also, as was already said, I'm a very big Ember fan. You can also see it here on the top of my laptop, a lot of like Ember stickers. I also have like all the merch with like plush toys and everything. So please bear with me if I mention Ember like through the next 30 minutes repeatedly. And yeah, I'm also involved in the learning endeavors that were already mentioned. And also, yeah, I'm also an organizer of the Ember Berlin meetup, and if you happen to be in November in Berlin, you should also definitely pop by, just like say hi. But let's actually get into the topic. Like the topic itself is something that's very close to my heart, and I feel very personal about it. In fact, like since I was a little child, I was already a great fan of comics. And here in the background, you might see a couple of like comic designs that you found yourself very interesting, like maybe some DC or Marvel comics. In fact, I actually wasn't really such a great fan of these, to be honest. Like the only thing I was very passionate about when I was younger was stuff like that, you know. So I hope a couple of people can relate here in the audience. And what I also realized recently is actually, well, like, it has been quite a while that we just had these paper books, like these magazines that we would pick up in a kiosk or like a shop, and we just like skim through them and just like read them very traditionally. But actually now there's like this new thing, right? It's like 2018 by now, and we can do new cool things. We can also bring our comic books onto the web, right? We can just like put them out there and have like people actually visit websites to see like cool art experiences. And in fact, I'm also a very great fan nowadays of webcomics. Like, there are a couple of examples that I'm really fond of. For example, I love Nedroid Comics. It's like a very cool, very kind of like cheeky comic series with very short snippets, like usually just like 2 or 4 frames, featuring the adventures of like Bird-tato, which is like a bear who looks like a potato. This is like his kind of like spirit, you know, and like another, I don't know actually what he is, like he could be a pigeon or something, I'm not sure actually, but he's also really cool, and I really like these. And what I also realized, it's not like only a format like this that currently exists. So in the case of Nedroid, we see that like an artist would usually either actually create some sketches or like some drawings in maybe like some graphical tool and just like get out like in PNG or like any kind of other image format and just like put it on their website, as in the case of Nedroid. But there are also other formats how people, like artists, actually share their comic work with the web and like with the world by this means. And a common tool that is used for that is actually social media. like platforms like Twitter and Instagram allow like artists in like one click to actually like just share very short comic strips, for example, with their followers and like other people who are really enjoy their art. And I'm also a really great fan of Ruby etc. She does like really cool and very kind of like to the point comic strips, as I find. And I find it really cool that she uses one of the tools that I would check like regularly every day as well to actually share art, because this is something that actually makes me, as like an avid reader of comics, very easy to keep up with who's currently out there, what are people actually putting out there. And I find this really cool. And what I was thinking after seeing like all of these cool artists actually doing very cool things was like, well, like I actually like to draw as well, right? Maybe I'm not that good as like maybe this NetRed person or maybe some other artists out there. But I think like maybe if I just like try, maybe I have like some fun with it and maybe I can do something like this too. And I hope that by looking at like some of the things that I've learned, you might also have a bit of like idea of, maybe I could also do something like that. But before we get started, I want to share with you some of the thoughts that I had about like how a comic book is actually composed. I was thinking that like comic books, like the traditional comic books, actually follow like a very kind of like common pattern, I would say, right? So it's usually just like a book or a zine. It kind of consists of several pages, right? You can just like skim through them, and like the pages, they don't really have like a specific semantic unit. They're just like kind of a sequence of different semantic units, like for example chapters that you can kind of like go through while you develop and like further follow the story. And then like each of these pages has usually like a set of panels, right? So these are the squares that actually contain the content that actually kind of like lead us through the story. And then also in the end, yeah, of course, you have like some content in these panels. It's like images, but also like text. It can be actually only this, to be honest. And I was thinking, okay, like if I want to do a comic book, like maybe I should also start just like thinking about, okay, how do I actually get like my pages into my comic book? So I was thinking, okay, like actually what I just need is like kind of like how would I say, like a collection of like different panels like in one specific unit. And I was also thinking, okay, like I'm a web developer. I usually like in my day job I build like single page applications. So maybe I could also create this like in form as a web app. As you can already imagine, like I'm really into Ember, so I also want to show you an example of an Ember app, how I actually did that. But I also want to, first of all say that this doesn't really mean that, okay, like there's this thing in Ember, so how should I actually do that? Like, it's probably not possible. This is totally not the case. It just means I want to show you how some of the problems that I encountered work very well in Ember. And of course, if you work with another JavaScript framework, or maybe not even with a JavaScript framework at all, maybe you find like vanilla JavaScript really cool, or you find like other ways to do it, this is totally also feasible. So just like as a disclaimer, this is not like hopefully not an Ember marketing talk only. But just like a quick show of hands, like I'm actually like wondering, like, are actually JavaScript developers, like people who regularly work with JavaScript here? Like, can you give me a quick show of hands? Okay, cool. Okay, yeah, quite a bit, yeah. At first I was like worried there were a lot of like designers as well, it seems like in the past talks, so I was wondering. So if anything, I try to just like go through examples very meticulously. In Ember, it's very interesting what you might also be familiar with from other SPA frameworks or libraries, that there is this concept of routes that actually kind of allows us to define application state and also set application state at certain time points. And in Ember, the routing pattern, like actually having specific routes that you can enter once you enter a certain URL, for example, mycomic.com chapters, or even if I wanted to load like a specific chapter, chapters/1, is something that's very conventional and very ingrained in the Ember ecosystem. So usually if you would try to build out a new feature and you would know, okay, like for this particular feature, I actually require a very specific app state that has to be there. For example, I have to load specific data for this specific app state. I also would have to show a very specific UI state in this specific area of the application, you would usually start with creating a route. And this is also what I did here. I realized, okay, I want to have certain pages in my comic book. It should be a bit traditional, actually, like very similar to what I have like in a written form. So I also try to create these pages, and I start with a route. So I generated, like with Ember CLI, I use like the generator function, and then what I get out of there is first of all setting in my router map. So this is a file that actually allows me to list down all the routes that are currently in my application and makes it like easily for me also, comprehensible which kind of app states are available. And in there, I would first of all create an overview route for all my chapters, for all my pages that I have. And then also I would create a singular route, like something that I can actually enter into, and I can say, okay, like I just want to load this specific chapter. So what would happen, for example, what I could configure later on is that I only load configuration data for this specific page. And I can also, kind of like change my UI state depending on that. And once I've done that, I actually have to write something for my route and to actually make it do something more specific. And the only thing that I will show here is just like very simply how this data loading could work. Like for my webcomic application, for example, I load some configuration data for these pages from a simple Rails backend. And here, for example, I could now create a new route, and I use the model hook that is provided by Ember's API to actually load this data and also make it like easy for me to make my application UI state wait for this data to actually arrive in my app. So this is something that my framework does out of the box. Whatever you work with, may it be like Vue or React, something very similar exists there as well. I'm pretty sure about this. And what I can do here, I can use the Ember store. So this is like the reference to the data layer that I have in my Ember application, and I can actually fetch my chapter. And what it does under the hood is it does an HTTP request to my backend and actually loads this configuration data for this specific chapter. So, okay, we got this. So we actually load the data, also, of course, like create some UI markup for this, but what is more exciting for me is actually to show you what I did with my comic panels and what kind of ideas came into my mind while I did that. At first I was thinking, okay, like, how does a comic panel actually work? Like, what do you need for a comic panel? I was thinking again, like, okay, like, let's actually look like at maybe a traditional comic page, like how does it usually play out there? And what you will often find is if you, for example, read a comic strip, something like this, like Calvin and Hobbes, then it's something, I don't know, that might be not so apparent if you never really think about it, but I was thinking more about it when I tried to create this webcomic, and I realized actually, like, if you have traditional media, like you just have like print media, you are actually very restricted, right? So for example, here we would like to, or the artist would like to depict how Calvin first has this conversation with his grandma, and then suddenly he starts like to have like fantasies or something like that, like he sees like something very different, and in this other moment he starts to jump out of a window, and the next moment the grandma will actually like catch him up so he doesn't fall out. And this is something that's actually like an emotion, like something that should actually be more something like animated, but because we're on print media, this of course doesn't work. What instead very nicely works is actually to have like a sequence of images, and as the reader goes through the sequence of images and looks at them and also like reads the text, they get an idea of, okay, this is like actually the story. So once I follow from one panel to the other panel, I can actually fill in the gaps like myself, like imaginative, and kind of like find out what actually happens. And I was thinking, okay, fair enough, like everyone understands that, and it's maybe like a good start for me to kind of like build out my comic panel. So something similar is also what I did. I was like, okay, let's maybe create some panels, draw some pictures, you know, I can also kind of like draw the waves in a little bit like different ways, so it looks like the sea's moving, you know, like if you look at it, like with a lot of imagination, you go like, okay, the sea's moving, I can see it. But then, again, I was thinking, okay, like, I got this, but now this is not super exciting. Like, I could probably have done this, like, in Sketchbook, or I could just have drawn something on a piece of paper, scan it in, and, like, uploaded it. So this is not very exciting. I was thinking, actually, if you really look into what you might do, like, in your day-to-day work, like on the web, there are so many tools and abilities and APIs that you can leverage to actually create very immersive and very interactive user experiences. I think we saw a lot of like examples in this conference already. The web actually provides us with a very great platform and also like a canvas to actually create very interesting and much more immersive experience than the print media would ever allow us. And I was thinking, okay, like I actually want to get a little bit more creative. I also had a look online, like I was thinking, okay, like what kind of like things are already out there? And I found something very interesting, and I also wanted to share this with you, like maybe you can have a quick look into that. It's actually not, I had another look, it's actually not like a specific web experience because it's actually like a native application, but similar things like these exist. And I find this example just like so beautiful that I still want to share it, although it's like actually a native app. And it describes kind of like art project by Marietta Wren and a group of artists who have worked for several months on this project that actually tries to create a very immersive art experience. It's very cool and also makes you really think more about how media could actually be used. This specific app, for example, should be consumed via an iPad, and as you use this application, you can scroll through the different screens, and you have this immersive experience of, oh, there's this never-ending panel that will just like carry me through the whole story and also the interactions between the characters. And I find this, also just like art-wise, it looks like very stunning in my opinion. And thinking about something like this, I find it, very inspiring to see like, oh, like actually you could do so much more if you're actually like on the web, right? Like we can actually make this happen. And so it came to my mind, okay, like I also want to, oops, how does it work? Oh, perfect. Oh, I also want to, now I got the joke away. So we have been on the web for quite a while, right? And probably you might already know there were a lot of people already around that tried to achieve something like this, right? So they tried to create like more interactive experiences. And maybe some of us might still remember the days when you went like to a website and was like, have you installed like your plugin so you can run this Java applet, to see this very cool thing. And I can imagine like probably most of the people around like maybe the ages of like N20s or like 30s up, they might also feel like very, like maybe very reminded of like big parts of their career when they see this, right? We could also create like very great experience of this actually, and it was like very heavily used until, just like maybe a few years ago, maybe a few more than a few years. But luckily, it's not that this era has ended. Although we don't really use Java applets that much anymore, although we don't use Flash so much anymore, there are so many other great tools we can use. CSS3 is only one amongst them. And one that I found really interesting for creating my webcomic was actually an API that has just been recently introduced into the web, and it's like recently used in different contexts, which is the Web Animations API. The Web Animations API is still quite experimental, but there are already polyfills available that allow you to use the standard set of API in this specification, and also Web Animations Next polyfill that allows you also to use more experimental and still like under discussion features of this API. And I find this really cool. And let's actually have a quick look how this might play out. The Web Animations API, if you look at it, boils down to maybe one specific core element, in my opinion, which is a keyframe. And a keyframe is something that you can create using a certain DOM element. The Web Animations API is all about trying to animate DOM nodes. So this is like also very convenient because we actually embrace like the native API of the web, which is HTML with that too. And we have keyframes and also animation options that we can pass into a keyframe effect constructor, and then we actually create a keyframe. And if we actually look at these animations, like the keyframes that we can create, we see an API similar to this. So we could, for example, create an array for keyframes, and in this array are like certain objects that actually have like certain animation options, like for example transform, or I don't know, you could have all kinds of things, any kind of like CSS property that you can think of. And when you look at this, you realize, okay, this seems like actually very familiar. this like seems pretty much like a CSS3 animation. And this is very powerful in my opinion because it means once I actually have like some familiarity with CSS3 animations, the Web Animations API seems to me already very familiar as well. And I can just like start getting my very dynamic JavaScript animations into my application. What also is necessary for a keyframe effect are animation options, also very similar to the API that you might see in like CSS3 animations, and you can use any kind of property there, for example, durations, iterations, fills, and all kinds of things that you might think of or that you have seen already while tinkering with CSS3 animations. And once we have all of these elements of our keyframe effect, the DOM node that we actually would like to animate, but also the keyframes and the options, we can actually get started to create our keyframe effect and actually apply it to our comic panel. What I was thinking was that, okay, this is already quite cool. Like, I can maybe like, yeah, just have, for example, like an image or something and actually move it a bit or whatever. But what I actually wanted to have is something like more, kind of like very cartoonish, kind of like animation. I really wanted to do something like, you know, Disney. This is what I was thinking. Okay, like I'm just gonna do really cool Disney animation, just like, you know, with like 1,000 less people on my team and less budget to actually make it, just like me, you know, my living room. But it's still gonna be really cool. And I was thinking like one element that it boils down to, if you look at many of these cartoon animations, is actually sprite sheet animations. And I was thinking, okay, like I maybe want to have something like this. I want like have maybe I created like a really cool sprite sheet of like different images stacked on top of each other, and then I just like kind of display them one after another. And I was also thinking it would be so cool if I could also have like a multi-layered experience. If I could actually make it happen that I could animate different layers in my comic panel independently to make an even more immersive experience possible. So I started out and I was like, okay, like this sounds very complex actually, and how do I actually try to break down this complexity in my single-page application? One thing that immediately came to my mind was to try to break down anything that I realized would be very reusable later in the end and could also be configured just like slightly another way to just like create another experience into a component. In Ember, for example, components work very similar to other frameworks that you might already use. They are usually just like small units of my application in which I can configure any kind of like DOM nodes that should, for example, be wrapped in, but also any other configuration options can be passed into my component. And I can also use different hooks, lifecycle hooks that are executed during the lifecycle of my component. For example, hooks that will be executed once actually my component has fully rendered, hooks when my component has been removed from the DOM, and other kind of lifecycle hooks. In my component now, I will create a setup function, and this setup function will now be responsible for creating these keyframe effects. And I also realized, actually, because these layers should act independently, I would like to have a keyframe effect for each single layer that I create in my comic panel. So I create this comic panel layer component, and I pass in the keyframes. I just like shift through the background position of like an image that I've appended to my panel, so it's like sitting in the background of this layer. And then also I pass in animation options to actually make these move. And a very cool thing that I can use for sprite sheet animation is the step function in the CSS spec to actually make it possible to not ease through my background image just like linearly, but actually incrementally in steps to make it possible to show one image after another by shifting the background. And I can iterate how often I want. I can also have to provide a duration for my animation to actually make it work. But once I've passed all of this down, I can actually create my keyframe effect and return it from this function. Later on, I can use one of a lifecycle hooks that are provided by the component API. I use the did insert element hook to actually create the keyframe effect, and it will only be created once my component has fully rendered. And the DOM node for my component is also available to actually create this keyframe effect. And then also I will call an onSetup function that has been passed into my component from the comic panel, which is the parent component of my comic panel layers. Why does this make sense? We will see in a bit why I actually want to make sure that each layer actually has created these keyframe effects to do something on top of that that will be very cool later on for user interaction. If we, for example, go back to our comic panel component, we now see that we also created this action that is passed on in the panel layer. And this one will actually add all of the effects that are sent up from my panel layer and will add it to an array that only the comic panel component will be aware of. And once I have collected all of these effects, all of these keyframe effects that are now stored in this array, I can use another part of the Web Animations API called Group Effect. And the Group Effect will now allow me to actually gather together all of these keyframe effects and make it possible to apply play controls on all of these effects all together, which is really cool. So you don't have to read through all of this, but what is very important to know about this, we create the group effect, and we create an animation, which is another part of the Web Animations API, and actually set this animation onto our component so we can later on actually have access to it. And once we have done that, we actually have the ability to use the play and also the pause method of the Web Animations API to play and pause animation as we go whenever we want. This, to be honest, it's already kind of cool, it's creating a GIF, right? Kind of, right? But then you go why did you have to build a web application for this? Actually, you could probably just create an index HTML, just sprinkle together maybe a couple of lightweight components, or maybe just write vanilla JavaScript itself and just use the API. What I think web applications can really shine in is if we try to integrate any kind of complex behavior like animations with user interaction. And there, for example, the framework can really help us to manage the app state and manage the user interaction and also be aware when we actually have to stop, for example, responding to user interaction, or when we actually just want to have a very easy way to separate the concerns of our animation process. In this regard, for example, I really liked with working with the framework that I have this easy separation of concerns, and that also the conventions that are enforced by the framework really help me to also know which kind of parts I'm actually dealing with. If I already know that I have a convention that certain components should be composed a certain way, I can make very easy access to lifecycle hooks, and it's also easy for me to later on, if I create, for example, lots of other layer components that might have a slightly different behavior, to not be, to be just much more maintainable in the future. And last but not least, also, the cool thing is once I actually work with a framework or a library, and also if it's very convention driven, oftentimes can very benefit from the community, because conventions actually help other people to create plugins and add-ons that can be easily pulled into my application without me having to worry to tweak it again or having to find out how it actually integrates well. It just kind of works. One thing I found really cool when creating this was an add-on that I found to make my user experience of it a little bit more immersive. I was thinking it would be so cool if, for example, a user came onto the page and as they scrolled through, they would realize, oh, this still image suddenly starts to animate. There's suddenly something moving, right? So I was thinking it would be so cool if there was a way for me to actually track where the user is currently scrolling, where is he actually looking at, and then once they actually arrive at a certain part of the page, the panel that is specifically there would just start animating, right? So first of all, it sounds kind of simple, so probably I would have to play my animation in the right spot and pause it again, but then also I always have to keep track of where I'm actually scrolling right now, and how do I actually find out how my component will be in the viewport? How do I actually know that? Probably I would have to, probably there are native APIs how I could find this out, but then I was oh wow, this already sounds like a lot of effort actually. And I had a look again. I was okay, maybe there's something online that I can already use. And in fact, I found something very easily. It's called Ember in Viewport, and it's an add-on that someone else wrote. In fact, Sugar Pirate wrote it. You can find her there on Twitter. And she just created this add-on that's very simple. It's like a mixin. It's a functionality that you can sprinkle into your component. And once you have done that, you have certain lifecycle hooks that you can use, did enter viewport and also did exit viewport, that will be executed every time a component enters the viewport of the user or leaves it again. And just like in 3 lines, like I had to install it, then also, of course, import it, and then use the lifecycle hooks, I finally had the functionality that I just wanted. I just wanted to actually play the animation once I actually enter the viewport and also exit it again. And once I've actually done that, here's a beautiful integration of my app in an iframe, just if you're curious, I really like iframes actually. And here, for example, we can now scroll through, and as we do that, we can see that animations suddenly start to play, hopefully, yeah, exactly. And I think this is only one small example what you can actually do. There are, of course, a lot of other user interactions that you could play with. What about when the user actually clicks into your comic? What should happen if they scroll down? Could we maybe also resize panels or zoom into certain aspects of our application? And I think it's very interesting to think about how we can actually integrate the capabilities we already have through libraries and frameworks with the art that we're actually creating as well alongside. And I think after this starting journey into my webcomic experience, I kind of realized a couple of things, and I just want to share with you the kind of overview that I had also with this talk. And this is first of all that, of course, comics are going online and people are already doing it, and it's also increasing. So even though you might have not found so many webcomics maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it's quite a common medium, and people are trying to get more ambitious about it, trying to leverage more tools that we already have on the web. And the web is such a cool platform because it actually provides us with these tools and actually makes it possible for us to also play a bit more with the form, with the layout, with the presentation of the whole comic, and actually frees us of the rather restricted medium of print media. We also realize that native web APIs are always on our side, and they are already there for us to actually use. And although I would also argue that many of these APIs might not be as accessible yet, in the sense of, if I, for example, not very proficient in JavaScript, I actually might have made an effort to learn more about these APIs and really dig into it. But I also hope that over a very short time, we will have more tools actually available for people to reach out and to use these APIs by other means than just by using the APIs directly. Last but not least, I also believe that libraries, JavaScript, but also specific frameworks can really help us to make this experience much more versatile for our users, for our audience, and actually integrate the user interaction with the art that we are trying to create and present. And I really hope that you also got a better understanding of it. And last but not least, although I'm a very big Ember fan kid, I also very importantly want to note that it doesn't really matter what kind of tool you use. There can be many cool things that you can use nowadays as well. It also doesn't have to be Web Animations API. It doesn't have to be CZ3 necessarily directly. You can use many kind of things to create really cool tools. And I really hope that you feel very experimental and very free to just try out things. And most important of all, also to not set any limits to your imagination while doing so. And with that said, I would say, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much.